Okay, second myth. Most or all late-term abortions are medically necessary. So when late-term abortion comes up in politics, for example, last year when New York was liberalizing its late-term abortion law, or especially during presidential elections, it's going to keep coming up, you see articles like this. And I want to take a moment and point out, so the articles I showed you before about when life begins, you don't need to read those. They're garbage. But these articles, I think pro-life people should read. These are tough situations. I'm not telling you what you have to think about them, but you should be aware that they happen and you should wrestle with them. Every single one of these stories, and some of them include multiple stories, is of a woman with a wanted pregnancy, sometimes a very wanted pregnancy, who gets a horrifying diagnosis. And I don't mean something life compatible that's just intimidating, like Down syndrome. I mean something that is much, much more serious and physically debilitating or life-threatening. And they make a heartbreaking choice. They're basically using abortion like euthanasia, right? That's not the myth. These are true stories. These do happen. The myth is that these represent most late-term abortions. And so I've got to the point now where if they even have the phrase late-term abortion in the title, I already know the article is going to be this story, right? Now, before I continue, I need to define the term late-term abortion. It's not a technical term. There's a lot of different ideas about it. And recently, in the last year or two, I've noticed that pro-choice people are starting to accuse our side of making this term up to be confusing, which is not true. It's been used for decades by both sides, but whatever. So I want to be very clear what I'm talking about. When I say late-term abortion, some people think it means anything after the first trimester. Some people think it means anything after 21 weeks, that being important mostly because abortion statistics break down that way. You have the first trimester, first half of the second trimester, and then after 21 weeks. Oh, laser pointer. Okay. So some people think it means anything after viability, which is not exactly, but roughly 24 weeks. And by the way, every gestational age I'm talking about, this is 24 weeks after fertilization. I'm not talking about LMP, I'm talking about post-fertilization. So some people think late term is anything after viability. And some people think it should only be the third trimester, like maybe it's early term, midterm, late term. And rather than try to give you an argument about what I think it should be, I read all those stories that I just showed you, and I just marked where they were. So they're talking about their late-term abortions, and that's how far along they were. So presumably they think that's a late-term abortion. So for the purposes of this talk, and in general when I talk about this, when I say late-term abortion, I mean anything after 21 weeks. So a little over halfway through the second trimester. It's important to understand that non-medical late-term abortion is not illegal everywhere. A lot of people on both sides think that. I get that all the time. Well, you can't get it unless there's a medical emergency. That is false. So to break it down very clearly, and I got all this data from the Guttmacher Institute. If you're not familiar with them, they are abortion rights advocacy group, so there's no way there's bias to it. Like, not bias for our side anyway. The earliest one, Mississippi, they outlaw non-medical or elective abortion after 18 weeks. Then there are a bunch that do it at 20 weeks, presumably for fetal pain legislation. And so all of these states, you can get an elective abortion anywhere up to 20 weeks, and then after that, you have to have a medical reason. Then there are a few that do it at 22 weeks, a bunch that do it at viability, and there are actually 8 states where you can get a non-medical abortion after viability. In case you didn't already know, viability is when the fetus has a 50-50% chance of surviving if born. And every week after viability, that chance increases significantly. And yet there are 8 states where you can still get an abortion for non-medical reasons after viability. These are the 7 where you can get it any time in the entire pregnancy. To be quite clear, in these 7 states, yes, including Oregon, you can get an abortion for any reason at any time in the entire pregnancy. So when people tell you that we're making a big deal out of nothing because this never happens, and when it does, it's only for medical emergencies, certainly on a legal basis, that is not true. So it's 32 states where you can get a late-term abortion for non-medical reasons legally. They all have exceptions. There are some where even after they have their restriction, if there's a problem with the fetal health, you can get an abortion. 27 states if there's a problem with the mother's physical health. 14 more if her mental or emotional health is threatened. So when they say medical, they have different ideas about this. They could, if her emotional or mental health is threatened, they will call that a medical abortion. And all of them if her life is in danger. So when we have debates about late-term abortion and people say, well, what if her life is in danger? That's already true. every single state, you can get a late-term medically necessary abortion if her life is in danger. That's not what the debate is about. Also, just FYI, this is what it would look like if the states were free to make their own legislation. The green lines are all places, and these are the states we're talking about, where they tried to pass more restrictive laws and they got overturned or enjoined because they go up against Roe v. Wade. So if Roe v. Wade ever did get overturned, this is sort of the divergence you would start to see among the different kinds of subcultures within the country. Alabama and Utah would just be like, nope, done. And then at 6 weeks and is that right? No, sorry, 4 weeks and 6 weeks, that's the heartbeat bills that have started to come up. Or once you can detect a heartbeat via ultrasound, then they would outlaw it. But the green lines are all not enforced because they directly contradict Roe v. Wade. So just so you know, that's the legal status. It's important to understand that there are so many places in the country where you can get a non-medical late-term abortion because Americans do not like elective late-term abortion at all. So when you look at these headlines, I thought this one in the upper left was funny because it said millennials have a surprising view on later-term abortions. It shouldn't be surprising. Poll after poll after poll finds if you ask Americans about how far along the pregnancy is, the support drops dramatically as it goes on for millennials and for everybody else. So I'm going to give you some examples. Here's a Gallup poll from 2018. It said, when should abortion be legal generally? And you can see it drops off hugely as it goes on. I forget the exact numbers here, but I think it was something like 15% said, yes, in the third trimester it should still be legal, compared to over half in the first. Same thing here. A Marist poll from 2018 said, which one of these comes closest to your view? Abortion should be legal in the first 3 months, in the first 6 months, or any time. And one of the things I wanted you to notice here is the white columns are just pro-choice people. So even pro-choice people, they're much more likely to say legal in the first 3 months, and then after that, they don't agree as much. This isn't just a pro-life person thing. Excuse me. Same thing here. What if there was a 20-week ban? We always talk about fetal pain legislation and banning abortion after 20 weeks because after that, the fetus can feel pain. And what's interesting about this is even most pro-choice people are more likely to support that than oppose it. If it gets further on in the pregnancy, people get very uncomfortable. However, Americans are very supportive of medically necessary abortion. So here, Gallup asked in 2013, what would be a sufficient reason just in the third trimester, so very late, what would be a good enough reason to have abortion be legal? And maybe a third of people said if she can't afford the child, it should be legal. But it went up a lot once there was a problem with fetal health, fetal impairment right there, and much more if there was a problem with her health, then people are very supportive even in the third trimester. Same thing here, same idea, 2018 Gallup poll, they said in the third trimester only, should it be legal for any reason? And I think it was like 20% said yes. Then it went up to almost half when they asked if the woman had a life-impairing illness. And if her life was directly threatened, it was 75%. So you can see Americans are very supportive of medically necessary abortion. They're not that supportive of elective abortion, and they're definitely not supportive of late-term abortion, and they're definitely not supportive of late-term elective abortion. But they don't know the legal status. For the most part, they have no idea how common it is, or how accessible it is, I should say. The stories I showed you earlier, I was saying it's always the same story. It's a woman with a very wanted pregnancy, heartbreaking diagnosis, and then she gets an abortion. And then she bravely tells her story. I'm not being glib. It takes nerve to tell a story like that. And people say, see, this is why we need it. This is the opposite. This came out, this is the only time so far in my pro-life advocacy over the last 10 years, this is the only story I have seen where a woman comes out and talks about her non-medical late-term abortion. And it's important that you know about this because when this story came out, which was after I first made this presentation, I was shocked. This woman didn't know she was pregnant until 26 weeks, which is not as ridiculous as people act like it is. It depends on certain health conditions and things that can mask the pregnancy. She just didn't know. So she finds out at 26 weeks, which is getting very near almost the end of the second trimester. And by that point, she lived in Oregon. I think she still lives in Oregon. Even though in Oregon you can get an abortion at any time for any reason legally, it doesn't mean it's easy to do because providers don't like to do it. If it's not for medical necessity, a lot of them don't want to mess with it. It's complicated, there's liability issues, it's also harder on them psychologically and emotionally. They're humans too. And so even though she lived in Oregon where you guys don't even have gestational limits, she was struggling to find someone to give her a non-medical abortion after 26 weeks. So she raised $12,000 with the help of funds that help women get abortions, and she went to New Mexico and did it. There's no mention in her story of any problem with her health or the child's health. I was shocked when I read this, not because she did it. I know that this happens, but because they published it. And sure enough, when they did, look at the responses. I went and found their Facebook page just to see what people were saying, because part of me was like, see? And I went to look, and people were really angry. And these are pro-choice people. Here's an example. Please don't use examples like this as some form of advocacy. It actually harms the cause. The article was a poor example and only puts fuel on the fire of the disinformation campaign from the religious right. This story was useless in making any valid points about late-term medically necessary abortions. Where are all the other stories that more accurately reflect why women sometimes find themselves needing a late-term abortion? And I'm not saying this to make fun of these people. The myth I was talking about before, where embryologists say we don't know when life begins, they know what they're doing. They know exactly what they're doing. I think this myth is purported innocently. I think humans respond to really emotional, compelling stories. And at some point, lots of people hear those really heartbreaking, basically abortion, euthanasia stories, and they're really moved and horrified by them, especially if they have kids. And you imagine, what if it was me, right? They're coming from a place of empathy when they talk about late-term abortion. And it's ubiquitous to act as if, or directly say, that late-term abortions are only for medically necessary reasons. You have powerful voices directly saying this all the time. When Hillary Clinton was running for president, she said it multiple times. ACOG, the American Congress of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, they're put out in the media as this neutral arbiter of facts. They say it too. People say it all the time with no data to back it up, and people believe them because, one, you want to believe it, and two, you want to protect the women that you feel like were in this heartbreaking situation. So then you read a story like this, they're not saying, shh, don't talk about it. We all know this is true, but don't say it. I think they're saying this harms the cause because most of them aren't like this. They really believe that. And unfortunately, that's not true. The other reason this myth is purported innocently is because you hear all these really emotionally compelling stories and they stick with you. And then there's nothing to combat them. There's no data. And it's not just because people are hiding the data. There's actually very little data. It took me a long time and a lot of work with help of some very intelligent people that also have access to a lot of information before I could find almost any data on this. And it's not surprising. I don't think it's really a conspiracy. Relative to early-term abortion, late-term abortion is comparatively rare. It's like 1.3% of abortions happen after 21 weeks. So already you have a smaller sample set to draw from. It's also highly stigmatized. People don't even want to talk about their medically necessary late-term abortions. I've read stories of women who spoke anonymously and they didn't tell anyone. They said they had a stillbirth or something. They're certainly not going to talk about their non-medically necessary late-term abortions. So you've got a smaller sample set of a highly stigmatized situation. It's hard to find data on it. So then you have these really emotionally compelling stories on one side and crickets. It makes sense that people believe this. I think this is an innocent misunderstanding for most people. Maybe not Hillary Clinton, but most people. But there is some data on it. Hard to find, but I'm going to go over it with you just so you see where I'm coming from. This publication came out in the Perspectives on Sexual and Reproductive Health. It was done by Guttmacher researchers, so again, abortion advocacy people. And if you open this publication and you go to this page and you open Table 6, it will talk about the percentage of women seeking abortion because of health concerns. Please note the word concerns. They may have had a real health problem or not, but they were worried that they did. And if you read the paper, it talks about this openly. Like, for example, one thing that counted as a health concern is if she was pregnant and she didn't know she'd get good prenatal care. That counted as a health concern. So this is a very broad catch-all for any possible health issues, okay? And if you go to the bottom of the table, it breaks it down by how far along they were. And the furthest they go is after the first trimester. So after 13 weeks, 21% cited a fetal health concern and 10% cited a personal health concern. Now, it's possible that some of these women cited both, and so there would be some overlap there. But just to be conservative, I assumed they were all separate. And so if you look at that by like a pie chart, that means that in the first trimester, 75% of them didn't even have a concern about health at all, in any way. And then after the first trimester, it was a little bit different, but not a lot different. 69% still didn't even have a concern about health. This idea that nobody would get a later abortion except for medically necessary reasons starts to go down, but you see I'm only talking about after 13 weeks, not 21, right? So I was really curious what it would look like if you could go to 21, but this paper doesn't do that. Very hard to find, just like for the reasons I just told you. However, the state of Arizona does collect statistics on this. And if you didn't already know, states are not required to collect this kind of information, and they're not required to report it. Some states choose to, some states don't. It's another reason this is really hard to get information on. But Arizona does. And they break down their information by these time periods and for health reasons. So there's two trends I want you to notice here. First, look at the difference between these pie charts. When we're talking about any possible health concern, and when we're assuming there's no overlap between fetal and maternal health concern, you have this huge chunk. But when you're talking about actual medical problems, look at the difference. In the first trimester, you go from 25% maybe had some kind of health concern, less than 0.5% had an actual health problem when they got their abortion in the first trimester. And same thing with the first part of the second trimester. It gets larger, but it's still less than 10%. And then when you get to 21 weeks or later, there's two things I want you to notice. The first one is it does get larger. It is true. This is another reason this myth is so pervasive, because it is factually true that the further you go along in pregnancy, the more likely it is to be for a serious health reason. And people confuse more likely with majority. The second thing I want you to notice is that it's almost all for fetal health. The percentage of women with maternal health concerns is 1.6% in the beginning of the second trimester, 1.7% after that. The big difference here is fetal health. And that makes sense because there's a lot of health issues with the fetus that you cannot find out about until later in the pregnancy. But then the third thing I want you to notice is it's still not most of them, is it? Almost 80% of them are still not for health reasons. So it is true that it's more likely to be for health reasons, and it's also true that it's still not usually for health reasons, at least in Arizona. And this was from, I don't know if you caught it, 2012 to 2016, but I also checked the numbers for more recent years, and the trends have not changed. This is another publication that was useful. They didn't look at 21 weeks or later, they looked at 20 weeks or later, but it's the closest thing I could find. And they were looking at why women get abortions later instead of earlier. And the highlighted sections are, so it's ranked here for all women. This column is for women who were getting abortions 20 weeks or later. And so the most common reason they cited was they had trouble raising money for the procedure. And then they have this thing where they're sort of chasing the money, where they wanted to get it in the first trimester, they couldn't get enough money for that, and then it took so long that now they're so far along they need a more expensive procedure. And so I'm not saying that's unimportant, but it's not a health-related reason. Then there was almost a tie between the rest. They didn't know they were pregnant earlier. They weren't sure if they wanted to get an abortion, and they had it's sort of similar to the money, they had trouble getting insurance coverage. And we could argue about how important or not important these reasons are, but they're not health-related reasons. The women getting abortions after 20 weeks, these were some of the major reasons. You don't find out soon enough, you don't have the resources. Oh, let me back up before you read that. So then I wanted to see if we could find out what proportion in the third trimester. So I've been talking about 21 weeks or later. Third trimester is more like 27 weeks or later. What proportion of them were for non-medical reasons? Because now we're getting very rare and very expensive and dangerous. At this point, the abortion procedure is no less grueling than just giving birth, right? So you would hope that nobody would bother to do it unless it was for a medical emergency of some type. I couldn't find any quantifiable data on this at all, and I'm not surprised because of the reasons I told you. But there are only a handful of people in the country who will perform non-medical third trimester abortions and publicly talk about it. And I looked them up, and many of them, not many, several of them, have done interviews where they talk about it. So this is Susan Robinson out of New Mexico, and she talks about, like we were just saying, she sometimes gets people that come in the third trimester because they didn't know they were pregnant earlier. She says they think they just got pregnant. They have no idea they're in their 24th week. They make an appointment for an abortion, it takes a couple weeks, they have their ultrasound, and they find out they're at 27 weeks, which is too far for an abortion anywhere. So then what happens? They either give up, have the baby, or they go on the internet and they find us. She's talking about people who seek her out to get a third trimester abortion, not for medical reasons, but because they didn't know they were pregnant earlier. Her colleague, Dr. Shelley Sella, out of New Mexico also, this is an interview of her, so the interviewer is the one explaining what Sella told her, and she said the women Sella treats fall into two categories. Those who discover fetal abnormalities, and those with healthy, viable babies whose maternal circumstances mean they could not cope with the baby. And I don't mean this to be casual either. If you read this interview and she talks about some of those maternal circumstances, some of it is very, very serious, but she's still talking about aborting. Her words, Sella uses the word baby instead of fetus, which is why the interviewer does. And she says that sometimes it's healthy, viable babies because her heart goes out to the women in these circumstances. This is Hearn out of Colorado. These are all states with no gestational limits on elective abortion. He doesn't share his clinic statistics and rarely speaks of individual cases, but Hearn has said he also performs late abortions for women who are not facing any grave medical outcome. So, when people tell you it's only for medical reasons, They're responding to emotionally compelling stories. They probably haven't spent nearly as much time as I did trying to find this very scant data. I get it. But the people doing this will tell you they do it. They fully admit it. And this doesn't give you an idea of proportion. I don't know how many third trimester abortions are non-medical, probably not many, but they do it and it's legal. I've shown these quotes to people before who didn't believe me, and then they said, well, they're not real doctors, they're charlatans. And I said, they haven't broken the law. What they're doing is not illegal, and you should be aware of that. You don't have to have a problem with it, but at least know that that's the reality. So when we talk about late-term abortion, understand that these stories, which I do think you should read, they're true stories, they do happen, but they do not represent most late-term abortions. And that's very relevant with a lot of the legislation. I don't know how many of you already are aware of this. Just recently when the Democrats voted against the Born Alive legislation, they talk about how these things never happen. They don't happen super often. Never is a pretty strong claim. They do happen.